So, welcome, Emma. Um,
Thank you.
I first came across your work on Brief Outlines. You did a series of works on Owen Barfield Saving the Appearances, which were illustrated, and they were a great, um, engaging way to um, get across Owen Barfield's ideas from that book. Um, Since then, I also discovered that you've got another channel called Steiner Studies, and the the video of my own that has uh, been the most popular was a response to one of the videos that you did on that. So thanks for that. And so yeah, I've enjoyed your channel and decided that it'd be a good thing to interview you. So welcome.
Thank you
So
very much.
now, those two channels seem to feature the ideas of Rudolf Steiner, Owen Barfield, and Goethe. Um, so, would it be fair to say that those three thinkers represent your own primary interests?
Yeah, that would be fair to say. I would say so. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Um, Although I've come to them very late in life, discovered them very late in life, they kind of consolidated a philosophical quest that I'd been on since maybe my late teens, and they kind of all brought it together and made it more clear, and at the same time helped me to develop way beyond what I would have been able to achieve on my own.
And I understand it was actually Steiner you came to before Barfield, and I'm assuming that it was through Steiner that you got an interest in Goethe as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, yeah, that's right. Yes, Steiner was the first one. Once I cracked that nut, or his philosophy of freedom, in any case, it opened up it opened the doors to both Barfield and Goethe, which were otherwise where they would have been remained shut. I think generally it's funny. Generally, Barfield is considered as somebody who is helping to make Steiner more understandable. But I think for me personally, it was the other way around. I don't know that I would have been
Mm-hmm.
able to understand Barfield if it wasn't for
Yeah.
Steiner.
And that was through Steiner's book, Philosophy of Freedom,
Yes,
primarily.
primarily, yeah, that's
Yeah.
right. Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Uh, so, do you see all of those three thinkers as being connected?
Yes, very much. Yeah, yeah. They're very different in their own way, but certainly very connected. There's a common theme, which I see as being very apparent.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, yeah.
So, what kind of a relationship do you see between them?
Um, that's a good question. Uh, I see them as mutually. Uh, I would need to give that maybe a little bit more thought. Hmm.
They're
Yeah,
almost
I would.
sequential, and so Goethe's the earliest, and
Yeah.
Steiner obviously studied Goethe, and I think
Hmm.
um, uh, Barfield and Steiner's life did overlap, but obviously Steiner
Hmm.
is considerably earlier than Barfield. So
Hmm.
if
Hmm.
there is a sequence of um, uh, what would you call it, influence, it would be
Hmm.
along that.
Yeah, that's a good point. I wonder if one could reverse them and put Barfield chronologically before both Goethe and Steiner. I don't know. It's an interesting question to think about.
Could he have happened prior to them?
Yeah,
Mm.
yeah, yeah. But maybe that's just yeah,
A little thought experiment.
yeah, for
Yeah,
idle curiosity.
yeah. Um, why is it that you wanted to promote their ideas?
Um, when, as I said, I had a sort of a philosophical quest starting from my late teens. Uh, I believe around the age of 20, I was confronted with the Kantian worldview.
Hmm.
And when I was talking to a friend and we were talking about understanding the nature of reality, I think we were talking about physics or something like that. And he was more informed than I was on philosophical matters, and he pointed out, well, hang on a minute, you can only go so far without how you can understand the world. There it comes to a point where all everything you experience, you have to admit that everything you experience is just within your own consciousness, and that ultimately you can't say anything certain about the world in and of itself ever. And at the time, I found that quite a sort of a shocking realization, but I sort of stumbled on an answer in my own way of answering it, and that was to think, well, hang on a minute, human beings are part of the world, and what our thinking and our inner life is part of nature, surely. Otherwise, why would you suddenly arbitrarily draw a distinction between what the natural world is and what human thought is? But I didn't articulate that properly. It was only an intuition, and it because I hadn't properly articulated and brought it into the light, I hadn't resolved the kind of the Kantian epistemology, as it were, in myself. So I continued in a sort of a world of contradiction and not being very satisfied with anything. And it was only when I discovered Steiner's philosophy of freedom and the way he bases everything on epistemology that I found a satisfactory way, which pulled me out of the what I describe as a hamster wheel of thinking about nature, where it just goes round and round and round. You're always projecting a metaphysical reality beyond your theory. Uh, so it helped me get out of that hamster wheel.
Right. So did you sort of have
And
an aha moment, like, um,
certainly, there was a aha moment, and I thought I just need to talk about this because there doesn't seem, yeah, I needed to talk about it um, and draw it. In growing up, I've always needed to draw things that I've been interested in. So drawing it was the sort of the go-to tool, as it were. And
mm-hmm.
when I tried drawing some Steiner, but it wasn't very successful. And then when I discovered Barfield, the Saving the Appearance lent itself so nicely to illustration that
Mm-hmm.
it kind of, it was easy picking as it was, as it were. Yeah.
Okay, great. Um, do you find there are particular difficulties in presenting the ideas of Steiner and Barfield?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's because it's almost like they're talking about something so obvious that it's difficult to say it without just sounding like you're stating the obvious. And yet it is something that needs to be really thought about to and worked through. So there is a challenge in making it too simple that it's like, oh, well, I don't even need to think about that. It's so simple and so obvious. Or saying it more in a more articulate and a more comprehensive way, but then making it so complicated that it's just like over the head and you fall asleep.
Mm-hmm.
So I
Mm-hmm.
think that's definitely the challenge I find.
Um, now, Steiner had a certain level of fame due to the Steiner Waldorf schools, biodynamic farming, and the anthroposophical movement. Um, do you find that the reputation that he's had helpful or a hindrance, or just doesn't make any difference to the way that his ideas are received?
Uh, yeah, that's a good question. My feeling is that whilst there clearly are hindrances and there's certain ways that it, the anthroposophical movement is perceived, and it has a certain image, and it probably has many shortcomings in the way it's presented to the world. Whilst that may be the case, I think Steiner was so ignored at his time with his philosophical work and what he was trying to achieve. He was so ignored that without this movement, I don't know that you and I would be talking about these things.
Mm.
I don't know
That's a good
that.
point. Yeah, because philosophy of freedom and his work on Steiner, uh, it didn't make a big splash.
Yeah, not at
Um,
all. It was at best misunderstood, at worst just thought trash.
yeah. um, so now it's getting close to 100 years since Steiner died. Do you think there has been much assimilation of his ideas in that time?
I think certainly there is, and perhaps more than we would think or would be obvious. There are, like you mentioned, the obvious ones like biodynamic farming and Waldorf education. There's some medicine as well, um, but my suspicion is that more people have been exposed to these ideas, maybe not, if not directly, but slightly indirectly, and I think they
Mm-hmm.
have a life,
Mm-hmm.
and I wouldn't be surprised if there's more influence than we would expect. Yeah, yeah. Even though on the surface it doesn't seem like that's the case.
Mm, interesting. Okay. Um, do you also place Barfield's work within the context of the Inklings? That's C.S. Lewis, Tolkien, and Charles Williams.
Mm. Yes, so he's one of the Inklings and was very influential on both C.S. Lewis and Tolkien.
Mm,
Uh, but he doesn't get much recognition as being such. And uh, I I have studied a little bit C.S. Lewis and Tolkien, but not all that much. Um, so I wish I had more to say on that group
mm,
and their dynamic.
mm.
Um, but
Y-
there's some very interesting videos of Barfield talking about C.S. Lewis and Tolkien online. There's still an archive
yeah.
of some interviews, which are very interesting,
A-
enjoyable to watch.
and there's a book of his, particularly on C.S. Lewis.
Oh, is that the one about the Great War? Or
Uh,
the
no, actually, there's a great. I think there is a Great War book. I have not seen that,
I
but
once
it's a
tried to look for it.
collection of essays of Barfield on Lewis. Nearly all of them were written subsequent to um, Lewis's death. Uh,
Yeah, that's not a book I've read. It sounds
right.
like something I should.
Yeah, I really recommend it. I do find it interesting that, that there's sort of another group of Barfield's sort of within two spheres of
Mm,
writers, and um, uh, he's essentially, I think, part of both. So, uh,
right.
yeah. Um, how receptive to these ideas of Steiner and Barfield do you think people are, and why?
My feeling is that on the whole, people aren't all that receptive. The and perhaps it goes back to the challenge of it's either it seems so obvious that it doesn't need thinking about, or
Mm,
it seems convoluted and too abstract
mm,
that there are more important things to get on with.
yeah,
Uh, yeah, that's definitely the challenge. It seems to me. Yeah,
yeah. It seems to
and I can
me
understand that.
um, he's Barfield and Steiner uh, addressing a problem that a lot of people don't realize exists.
Yeah, yeah,
um,
I would see it that way. Yeah.
all right. So we mentioned epistemology before, or sorry, you did. Do you want to say first what is epistemology?
Yes, good question. Technically, it's a theory of what knowledge is, but to me that sounds very dry and meaningless and abstract and
Mm-hmm.
like we were saying, a kind of who cares what
Mm-hmm.
where's the practical life in it. Uh, the way Steiner talks about epistemology, what he's really talking about is the way I see it is the relationship between our own inner self and the world. What's that relationship? What is my place in this world? What am I actually? What is the world and what am I? And as Barfield points out, at this moment in time in modern uh, phase of human existence, we are very isolated in our consciousness. Our our epistemology is that I am in here inside my head, and the world is outside of me, separate from me, and we have this picture of ourselves as like a floating nomad, or yeah, a floating entity of sort of non-existence in this
Mm-hmm.
material universe.
Mm-hmm.
And our thoughts are just things that are created in our heads, which have no real relationship to the things in the world. And this is a heightened state of alienation and separation from the world. And so the question of epistemology is actually a question of finding the pathway back to reality, to find what to discover what in reality is also within us.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, yeah. So that's how I see the term epistemology taking meaning.
And how important do you think it is uh, for both yourself and people generally to be aware of their own epistemology, or their any suppositions and or presuppositions of uh, not in a um, you know in within the realm of universities and studies, but for um, you know just uh, any person.
I think it can have a radical change in one's life. It certainly had one for myself. I think one of the things that I noticed in myself most immediately is I didn't have this sense of victimhood anymore. Previously, I felt I was kind of a victim of my own genetics and my own brain.
Mm-hmm.
And once I came to a relationship to the nature of thinking itself, it's like I couldn't sustain that idea anymore. It just evaporated instantly, and I once one makes thinking the datum for for the nature of reality itself, you, you can't, even though you can be erroneous in your thinking, you can't anymore have the idea that the thinking itself is ultimately totally arbitrary and separate from reality.
Mm-hmm.
and and so at the same time one can no longer pretend as though one is cut off or isolated or a victim, like some yeah, a victim of genetics or brain chemistry or something like that. So I think the implications are very far reaching and radical.
Mm-hmm. Um, so, one of Steiner's earliest books was A Theory of Knowledge Implicit in Goethe's World Conception. Um, and in that, he was so basically saying this is the epistemology implicit in Goethe, but
Mm.
Goethe never uh, wrote a book of his epistemology or talked about it. Um, uh, what do you sort of make of that? Why do you think Goethe didn't do that, and why do you think Steiner did?
Oh gosh, yeah. I've thought about this for quite a bit. I don't really know so much, but I have an intuition. Like I have some friends who are very pragmatic and get on with life, and they get very annoyed by analogies like Barfield's rainbow.
Mm-hmm.
They've just, it's just like, oh, why would you waste your time with this nonsense? It's sort of so
Mm-hmm.
obvious. And I have a sense that Goethe had that similar, like he said, I think I did well. I've never thought about thinking, and for Goethe that was like a positive thing.
Yeah, but for
He
Barfield and Steiner, that's pretty
it
much
was
all they did.
Yeah. So it's an interesting. You can really see a difference in their personalities.
Mm,
Uh, Steiner, I think, saw it was absolutely necessary because thought had got to a place where it had sort
mm,
of jettisoned itself from the rest of reality
mm.
and tangled itself in all these knots and
Yeah.
confusions. And Steiner realized it was really necessary to untie all this and reconnect with the
Mm,
world.
yeah.
And Goethe was like an example of how where one would be at if one doesn't jettison oneself from reality, it,
Mm,
philosophically jettison oneself from
mm.
reality.
Yeah. It seemed to me that maybe Goethe um, uh, he was aware of the kind of traps of intellect, but in a sort of more intuitive way.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
he avoided those traps, uh,
Yes.
but he didn't um, think his way out of them. Or
That.
uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
mm.
Yeah. That sounds good. That sounds nice. I like it.
um, and so, do you think Steiner um, portrayed Goethe accurately, or Goethe's thinking?
I think to a point. I think probably. Uh, but it's very, for to me, it's very clear that Goethe is offering Steiner an opportunity to express something in Steiner,
Mm,
and I think ultimately one would have ultimately I feel he's used Goethe for something that he felt is very important
mm,
as rather than just being an academic um,
yeah.
insight into Goethe. Yeah,
Mm,
yeah, he's doing both. I would say at the same time.
mm.
It seems to me anyway.
It's interesting too because Goethe is like the biggest figure in German literature.
Mm.
So he's huge. I mean, we don't see that so much, I think, in English
Mm.
speaking
Yeah.
countries. Um, but it's interesting that you know, going into Goethe from Steiner, who certainly within uh, German literature is not regarded uh, on that same level.
Mm.
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 All right. Now, I think we've spoken a little bit about this, but do you think that when Steiner or Barfield talk about thinking, they're doing something that is easily understood and common, or is their focus uncommon? And um, if uncommon, how would you describe the difference in their approach to thinking as to what people generally think of as thinking?
Oh yeah, great question. Yeah, I think it is very uncommon.
Mm-hmm.
It's not, yeah, and radical. The analogy I would compare it to is if you ask if you ask the if you ask the average person what color is light, because of our physics training, we would say, well, the light is white, uh, and that's how I see most of us thinking about thinking. It's like, well, thinking is thinking,
Mm-hmm.
and what Steiner and Barfield are doing is going really into it and going, well, hang on a minute, no, light isn't white because white is a color, and we don't actually ever see light. We only see it when it hits an object, and it's the reflection of the object that we're seeing, not light itself. And it's sort of a similar thing. It's like, oh yes, I know what light is and I can see it, but actually, no, it isn't. It's
Mm-hmm.
that's You need to think about it a little bit further.
Yeah.
You can't just stop there.
Okay, great. Do you think there is a need for the ideas of Steiner and Barfield um, in our particular cultural and intellectual milieu at the moment?
I feel there is, from my own experience. Definitely, like what I touched on earlier about this idea that we're sort of victims of genetic evolution and victims of our brain, victims of our brain chemistry. I think that these are ideas which are absolutely at the front
Mm-hmm.
of cultural dialogue with things like mental illness, and uh, and I think so much of that is predicated on a worldview where there is no spirit in the world. There is nothing in the world of itself except dead material, meaningless matter. And the story of how we got here is dead and material and meaningless. And how can one lift one's spirits in such a world? It's just not possible without, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems absolutely essential to me that we need to come to a new understanding of our place in the world, see the world in a truer light. Uh, yeah.
Okay, thank you. That's the end of my questions. Is there anything further you want to say that I haven't covered, or yeah?
I think, well, I very much, yeah, hope we could continue the discussion. I think there's much more to be said, maybe in future videos, and so that,
Okay,
yeah,
great. Yes, I do
great,
feel that this was sort of an introduction to these
cool,
thought once over lightly. Um, Thank you very
brilliant.
much.
Yeah, I'd look forward to it. Thank you,
Cheers.
Kerry. Thanks for having me.